And I'm thinking from the point of view that if there's one key word more than any other that combines the concerns that I have and that I kind of sense also in the angle of this conference, it's that need to facilitate conversations and discussions across fields and across disciplines and inside and outside of the university. My point of view as an academic starts essentially with my own university, which is a fairly small university, fairly recent. We began as a formal university in 2007, and before that we were a university college over a number of decades with a strong tradition in teachers' education training. So by 2007 and reaching up until 2020, this has become a university with about 13,000 students, 1,150 staff, thereabouts. 5 key campuses, or key faculties, in addition to a business school, so 6 all told. The question I think that we were facing a number of years ago when I started what we called and still call the Future Learning Lab is this discussion of how to implement and think about and understand the enormous changes coming from the media environment that we see changing at an accelerated pace. And then also this conference that we have annually that I will get back to at the very end. I have to say also that I teach media studies, so my perspectives on these are not necessarily education and pedagogy, neither is it engineering, but it is from that broader media sociological perspective of what's actually happening in higher education. I also teach in journalism at another university college, and I do that by teaching twice a year in Uganda and in Ethiopia. And for me, this is kind of a reminder as well as to how enormously different this setting is for teaching and for engaging with students when you go to East Africa compared to teaching at home in southern Norway. My university is at the very southern tip of Norway. It's a highly international region, I would say, and part of this has to do with the strong tradition we have in oil and gas and shipping. So in some respects, I gather kind of a similarity in a way to the presentation you gave of Oulu, in how the university engages with innovation, engages with various entrepreneurship hubs, entrepreneurship dynamics in the region. But when I started the Future Learning Lab 10 years ago as an invitation to my university to think through these things in a combined conversation, in a joint dialogue, I did something that I kind of think might make sense to repeat, just to show you a little bit of the thinking behind at a rather fundamental level. And I think we kind of recognize that universities, university institutions, the spaces that we call university, higher education institutions, have a very clear relationship to one particular innovation that happened a long time ago, and we call it the book. So from my point of view, a very basic question is really what's happening when we think about such a fundamental thing as the book and the printing press and the ripple effect that these had at a hugely, rather fundamental societal level. And then something that happened very fast and not that long ago. So in 2010, counting about 20 years back, that would take us to the 1990s, and key things that happened in the 1990s that sometimes I think we kind of take for granted, and our students certainly do. They think the internet is a human right and it's existed forever. I remember when I first got email in my office. And so it's not to bore people with sort of Stone Age histories, but at the same time it is a cause for, I think, concern and interest and some speculations maybe. So what I did when I had that very first workshop, I put up this picture. And the guy looks older. He was older than this back then. I don't think you'll recognize him, but I would be curious to see if anybody does. Have you? Yeah, so I guess maybe in this kind of an audience here that it's a kind of a dumb question maybe to ask. But when we were sitting there in our auditorium, launching this discussion in my university, it strikes me that a lot of people don't really pay attention to the enormity of the changes that happened in the late 1980s and early 1990s. So this is the hypertext markup language guy. Later on, knighted by the Queen of England and lots of other things. How about this guy? He looks very different, so I'm not even going to ask you to guess. But in 1985, he was voted Man of the Year in Time magazine, a young student at the time. In 1994, a colleague of mine at the University of Bergen, where I was then working, invited me into his office and showed me something called Mosaic. Mosaic today we know as Firefox. But just think again about how deeply those changes affected us at the university as late as the 1990s, because it is actually not that long ago when you think about it. It's a matter of perspective, of course it is. Famous, died a few years ago, holding something in his hand that I think we all recognize, but we might have to stretch our imagination a little bit. And it's a small picture, but what he's holding is the prototype of the computer mouse. It's a little wooden block with two wheels going one way and the other way. This is Douglas Engelbart from SRI, Strategic Research International, formerly called Stanford Research International in Silicon Valley. He worked close together with a guy that most of my colleagues did not recognize, but some people in engineering obviously do right away. But if you put the other Steve up, then you recognize them. And you see in a sense that there is a history here that goes very deeply, I think, into at least how we think as educators, how we think in terms of a media-driven pedagogy, but I think also in terms of how we think our universities and institutions. And I'm thinking that basically every time there is a key transformative media development, we tend to ask some of the same questions. Some of the questions have to do with deeper impacts on society. They have to do with sort of concerns with ethics, with morals, with the dangers, and so on and so forth. But I'm thinking that from a university point of view, it makes kind of sense to think of a combined discussion within the humanities, within engineering, within social science, within the health field, for instance. The question is, how do you do that? Because as universities, I think we all kind of recognize that we are specialized. We go deep. We have our disciplines. We have our faculties. We have our programs. And at times, I'm thinking that to generate that kind of cross-institutional discussion that is the beginning of the capacity building, or sort of the knowledge sharing that takes us into the next stage as universities, is an aspect of that wider discussion. Can we open up for instance, seeing the challenges involved in appropriating media technologies outside of the education aspect, the pedagogy aspect, the learning aspect, by looking at the university from other points of view, from kind of the spaces that we engaging, the architecture. I was kind of intrigued with your tall campus building, because that is very definitely one of these kinds of questions. How does it affect what we do, what our students do? What kinds of questions are we asking? If we're saying that education technology is the answer, then the question becomes, what are the questions? And I'm thinking from that point of view that what we wanted to do with the Future Learning Lab was to try to engage the university community in a more open and kind of cross-disciplinary and maybe also imagination, sort of inviting discussions as to what it is in higher education that's really on the blocks, that's being sort of fundamentally transformed as we live, so to speak, as we teach. And as an educator, as somebody who tries to make sort of sense of these various technological aspects, the tools, the changes in our classrooms, I'm kind of talking about this from a peer-to-peer level, from an educator to other educators, trying to make sense of how it also affects the stuff that I do on a daily basis. So what we tried to do with the Future Learning Lab idea was to set an agenda where we could basically try and look at our own institution from the point of view of how the institution itself, this is not so far-reaching, but how the institution itself is being transformed, that is being challenged, the kinds of interactions that we do, and what kinds of interactions a media-based, a technology-based, sort of a meeting point with the classical, traditional means and modes of organizing teaching and learning, how to think about the various technologies by trying them out. So we've established 2 actual physical labs for media-rich education, but also in the sense of how we then engage internationally and globally as a young university, but also a fairly globally minded university. So these were the kinds of questions that we started to put together, that we started to develop. And I realized that in some ways these are kind of basic, verging on philosophical questions more than the practical, how do we do it, solutions-oriented questions. But I think that in a very fundamental sense, what happens in the media age that we're living through has something to do with a profound change in the way that we read, the way that we learn. And I think that we're seeing in the research as well that there is more and more coming out in the sense of, for instance, how our retention spans change, in the sense of how we actually have a harder time reading long, deep texts. And I think those are key questions for us in the academic world to take very seriously. And my sense too is with my own students, how the perspectives that they come to actual reading materials. Maybe I idealize the old days, being a student myself, and the even older days before that. But I'm thinking that the way that we read, the way that we study, is hugely affected by the book culture, if I might call it that, the reading culture becoming a digitalized culture. So one of the key questions we wanted to raise is how do you really parse this with the way that we do course instructions, the way that we do course redesigns, the way that we do sort of redesigns of the various interaction modes that we employ across the various departments, across the various faculties at the university. So from this point of view, I'm thinking if I might just illustrate, and here is kind of the key in a way to what I'm still, I would say, many years later grappling with. As an educator, as somebody who is raised in an area where the paper-based, the book, going to the library, doing the searches in the library, sitting down and actually engaging with the text, what's happening. So if you kind of think about it and imagine what it is to pull out a book, some author that you might have discovered, some particular person that you keep following because you are engaged in whatever that person is providing, writing, I think we kind of acknowledge that there is a relationship here going on between the author and the reader. There is something going on when you have a book that you go through and a narrative that in a sense is being told by somebody, written by somebody, set down by somebody, and you engage in that in a kind of revelatory way that's different in a sense from that second perspective, which you can essentially compare by just looking at something like Wikipedia, or any place where you employ a more sort of exploratory reading style where you click your way through hypertextual links and you work your way through texts with a much more user-driven or reader-driven control over that text. And for me, these are key questions as to how I design, how I think, when I put together my reading, when I put together my course reading list, when I engage with my students and try to anticipate what it is that gets my students actually into the material where I want them. And I'm thinking this kind of more bifurcal narrative has many key, I think, similarities to the way games are being built and to game-based learning and the way that game narratives unfold on different levels with a much more focus on how the reader or the game player pursues a narrative and develops a narrative and lives within an ecology like this. And considering that this was some time ago, I'm thinking that these questions may at this point possibly be more sort of self-evident to more and more of us, but I'm thinking at the same time that it does also introduce and kind of invite a discussion as to the ecosystem that we call higher education, from that sense that it opens up different ways of connecting, different ways of collaborating, different ways of having students and interaction with students conceptualized from the student point of view rather than from the teacher point of view. So from our point of view at the Future Learning Lab, this is what we wanted to try and do as an approach or a methodology when we started to build these things, put these things together. Could skip that one. And I'm thinking that from a media studies point of view, from somebody who is sort of versed in and has been reading media studies literature, the one name maybe that stands out in this kind of a context as a reminder for somebody like me, fellow Canadian Blair, I think. Yeah. But what Marshall McLuhan kind of said, that any time that you want to look at the impacts or the effects of the media, look at the affordances of the media technologies and what they actually enable. And from that point of view, I'm thinking that if we look at the changing landscapes in education, changing landscapes in higher education, changing landscapes in how higher education connect with society, connect with business, teachers' education being one element of many in this, what we are in a sense seeing is a kind of media-driven ecosystem that's still in the process of being defined, still in the process of being explored, still in the process of being articulated, I think. So when we started up in 2010, I think at my university, this kind of an interdisciplinary, cross-cutting conversation was a new thought. We have since 2010 been doing our annual meeting points in a way to engage between disciplines, to engage between faculties, to engage between different kinds of competencies. What we wanted to do was to try and create a learning space for instance, course designs, curriculum changes that had a close focus on the student's point of view and brought students into the process of the change discussions that we had. We have been doing these things in a number of different ways that at the end here I will try to show. But I'm thinking that in the way that we try to organize this in a fairly, I would say, internationally by comparison, small university, asking some of these fundamental key questions that I think we kind of all share. We opted for trying to create an annual meeting point that we've had, and that's that World Learning Summit, which happens in May again this year. And if anyone's interested, I can fill you in on that outside of the talk here. Doesn't have to take up time here. But basically what we've tried to do with the Future Learning Lab is to create a space for returning people also to this sort of, how do you put this, share kind of experiences, share kind of challenges, ways, methodologies of actually making this sensibly as a dialogue also with our students. So this conference happens annually in springtime and has, I think, more than coincidental relevance in the kind of network that I realize you guys are building. So here is an invitation for us to maybe discuss. We can see. But the Future Learning Lab idea, the way that we wanted to approach this was something that the university now has taken up and actually made a methodology and set up a new center for, a collaboration center. But it's that notion that once you want to engage with new media means, new media technologies, a very likely starting point is to begin with your students and to begin with actually taking your students' point of view into the process of rethinking. So at the point right now, just to illustrate, we are going through a master's degree in multimedia education from exactly this point of view, where we're trying to, in the process of making changes and updating on the sort of fast changing media front, also updating via having students as key parts of the course and the program, discussions or interactions in terms of how to make this a new sort of next generation master's degree in multimedia studies. There are many aspects I think that we could discuss more in detail, maybe if there's in the workshops time to do this, but my basic concern is that there are some huge communication efforts and some huge communication challenges involved in doing these things internally in the university organizations. And I'm curious as to how other universities actually approach this as a challenge, because I'm sure there are many ways of doing it. My basic concern is that we come from such different points of view discipline-wise. We come from such different points of view in terms of our understandings of the basic challenge to begin with, that it's actually important to share also how it is that we grow our university institutions from the inside by actually taking that communication effort seriously. And I'm thinking that from that point of view, there are stories to be told, but that can be for some other time. One of the things that we did, just to illustrate as a project, it's linked here, and I'll send you the presentation, those of you who might want it, or maybe I can just give it to you, Blair. There is a link here to a project that we did together with what's now called the Southeast University, the University of Southeast Norway, the Norwegian Business School. And they have also, I think, innovations and entrepreneurship programs that are kind of similar to yours in a sense. I was reminded of that when I heard your talk. But they have something called a learning center, and then also my own university. And what we essentially did was we provided a whole range of video materials based on interactions with students and with staff, reflecting in this particular project on their experiences doing flipped classroom designs. That's one aspect, one type of project that we have been engaged in. The other one that I would just point to is also an invitation. This is a platform run by an online learning provider in Silicon Valley in California. They've been part of our conferences and co-hosting a couple of these conferences with us. But it's essentially to set up a platform for educators, for entrepreneurs and innovators to share basics, share backgrounds, share project ideas, results from projects, and so on. It's called NordicEdcast.com. Can be searched up on the internet. And so from this point of view, I'm thinking that what's a key concern for me and what's I've sort of been involved in since we started up in 2010 can be illustrated with some particular, I guess, names and people, but I would like to just point to one. Sorry about that. These things happen when you least want them. But I would like to point to a particular one person here who has been part of our group now for the last few years, Kathy Casserly, who is former CEO of Creative Commons, but also a pioneer in open education resources, because one of the key questions that we're facing, I think, is the changing boundaries between formalized education and non-formalized education. So how do we do that, and how do we create the kind of sort of possibilities and openings that both take care of the classic academic, the programs, the credentials, but at the same time open up for the kind of much more sort of micro level course deliveries, knowledge deliveries that business very often asks for. These are key questions in terms of how you parse two different systems. And for us to actually do this, it begins with, and it makes sense to begin with, the conversations closest to the problems, those who are actually living with it and faced with it, students. Students in their way into the work market. People in the work market asking us at the university to create programs with them, but we also recognizing that their sense of time is completely different from ours. Their sense of long programs completely different from what we do. Their need of much more sort of small, to the point, concrete units, rather different from what we traditionally do at the university. And it has very much to do with engendering this conversation in the sense that we shorten the gap, in a sense, between the expectations that we have. So this is what we try to do with the Future Learning Lab as an interdisciplinary tool at my university. It's also what we've tried to do by bringing our university into the international conversation where these things are going on through the World Learning Summit. And that was my talk, and I will say thank you. And I look forward to having discussions, questions, ideas, sharing throughout the day and tomorrow.